Good morning. It's, let's see, 7:30, and I'm going to get a sourdough bread dough started. The recipe does suggest that you start before 9 a.m. due to the resting periods and the incremental times that we need to go in to stretch and fold our dough. So I have everything out. I'm going to angle the camera down so you can see what I'm doing. But this is the starter that I am working with this morning. I fed it last night about 10 p.m., maybe just before actually, but roundabouts that time. And it's looking absolutely beautiful. It's grown quite a bit. I want to say I probably should start marking. I don't usually because I can visually see it has grown, but I mean we're talking it was probably right around there. I have not discarded any in a couple of days, so it's kind of grown because of that too. So we are going to do a pretty standard sourdough loaf. It is different than the last one that we worked with. So I'm curious to see how this one turns out in terms of scoring the top. My last loaf of bread tasted wonderful. Everything about it acts like a sourdough loaf of bread. It's just the inability to score the top was quite difficult. It also was a beginner recipe, as I stated in that video. The stretch and fold and repeating, that was not done a whole lot. I'm having a hard time remembering exactly how many times we did have to do it, but not nearly as many as we're going to in this recipe. And I think that is what is going to lend shaping and forming and working that gluten a little bit more to hopefully create a bit more of a firmer loaf. Now this also has a couple techniques that it suggests and one it actually says to do that will help to firm up that dough specifically for scoring. So I'm excited to give this recipe a try. I will have it linked down below to whom I received that recipe from. So the ingredients, as always, is filtered water. I'm going to need 300 grams. I did warm it up a smidgen because it's very cold in my house and I got it from the Berkey. Incidentally enough, there is something going around on Facebook on somebody testing out the theory of whether or not unbleached flour makes a difference in your sourdough starter. And so far, the last couple of feedings that they've done, their results are mimicked from the jar they have of unbleached flour to the jar they have of white bleached flour. They're also going to do a test on whether or not filtered water or tap water makes any bit of a difference. And so I'll let you know as we go along if I happen to be able to follow up with them anyhow. I'm curious to see what their results are. Habits die hard. I do know that there is some theories behind why you want to probably choose one over the other. I don't use bleached flour in the house anyhow, and so I wouldn't end up using it because it works. And I have my own personal thoughts about city water, tap water, unfiltered water. So I would likely not use it either. But I think for an average person where maybe that isn't techniques they use in their home, ingredients that they have to purchase for one reason or the other, it would be interesting to see, because some of you might feel left out, feeling like you have to go over and beyond just to do sourdough. So I just thought I would throw that in there. I think it is quite interesting. We need 100 grams of starter, 500 grams of flour, and anywhere from 10 to 15 grams of a good salt. Sea salt, Redmond's real salt, anything but iodized salt. And the reason you don't want iodized is because, of course, the ingredients that they add into it, but it tends to be so much more saltier, and you would not need as much salt. If that's all you have, use it, but I would maybe cut it in half to start, and then to see once it's cooked if it lends enough salt or not. You can adjust later on, but don't use the full amount because that salt is much more potent. Using a scale, I'm going to combine my starter and my water together, giving it a good stir to loosen up that starter, and then I will weigh my flour and my salt. You can expect that this dough will come together a bit shaggy. If you are familiar with yeast type of bread doughs, you'll really have to fight that urge in the beginning to want to really make and create a beautiful, cohesive kind of dough. The shagginess is okay, and that's actually something I'm still working to be okay with on my own. Shagginess, stickiness, that is all perfectly well, because as it rests and you come back and do the stretch and folds, your cohesive dough starts to form. So just trust the process and go through it knowing it isn't going to be this really tight ball in the beginning. The recipe I'm using suggests that you work with a countertop that is wet rather than flour. Adding in extra flour, even if it's just a lightly floured surface, might be too much for your dough, and you might start to incorporate too much flour in the beginning, and you really want a more hydrated dough in the very beginning of the process. It's also recommended that you keep your bowl wet while it's going through the rest phases. As I do my stretch and fold, I keep wetting my fingers because this dough is very sticky. And this is a process that I'm still learning myself as to how hard and tough should I pull, how long of a stretch should I receive. But I think this is a process that you just have to do so you can start learning for yourself with a hands-on learning experience. I do know as time comes you will see that the stretching does get much easier as the gluten is worked more and more. I like to keep a card with the steps of rest and stretch and folds as to, after each stretch and fold, how long is that next rest period. This way, when I come back, I can check off the part we are completing, and I don't have to rely on my memory, because this is going through the better part of our day of allowing rest periods of 2 hours, stretch and folds several times all throughout the day. A lot of things can happen from this morning till the time I'm ready to put it in the oven, or the very next day even. And if I rely on my own memory, I know I'm going to forget how many times I've already completed the stretch and folds. So I do recommend that you do the same thing, or maybe you can just create a note in your phone if you don't want to do pen to paper. Between every rest period, I do see that my dough is growing and expanding. That is telling me that my starter was in fact active and healthy. You might still want to go through the process if you are not seeing the same results, because I don't think we ever have any failures when it comes to bread. There is always something you can do with your bread at the end of the baking session. Even if it's just to make breadcrumbs from it, still go through the process because there is a lot to learn. This is the case of my traveling sourdough. So I did have to go to work today, so I just brought it along with me. And my friend and coworker is the camera woman for this particular stretch and fold. And I did notice that it was a little bit colder in our work office than it was compared to at home. And so I do think that affected the sourdough a little bit. But honestly, at the end of the whole process, it didn't, gravely affect it by any means. But I could tell that temperature played a key in the process. And so this next stretch and fold, my lovely husband helped me as well. We worked together. And so he's going and doing this stretch and fold video, recording it for me. Now, my sourdough really traveled quite a bit because I thought I was going to go straight home after the last stretch and fold, and I would get home and be able to jump right into the next process. Unfortunately, I was not able to because, as life would have it, I ended up having to go and take something to my daughter who was in a parade her senior year, and she forgot something, so I had to drive all the way home and then meet her where she was to drop it off, and ended up being well over the 2-hour rest period. But when I tell you that sourdough is very resilient, I mean that. I think it was honestly almost in total 4 hours that my sourdough ended up resting. And it did just fine. And so now we are attempting to do our last and final shaping. And this is where we are going to use flour. I'm using my basket mold that I have, and I always make sure that I flour that very, very well because I do not want anything to stick on the inside of that bowl. And I'm going to do my stretch and fold just as I have done each and every time. Nothing different here other than I'm using flour instead. Now, I do recommend for your fingers, if it's still a little tacky and sticky, which it most likely will be, I would actually continue using the water just for your finger part. I find that I received better results with trying to stretch it out than I did with the flour. So that might be something that you would want to keep in mind as well. Definitely a big difference between this bread dough and the first one that I did. I really could not pick up that last one. It was way way too sloppy and wet and sticky. This one definitely came together much better. It's a bit more firmer, but I can tell it's still a very hydrated dough as well. This is going to rest in the fridge overnight to where it will travel with me one last time. I am at my stepson and daughter-in-law's house because I watch my granddaughter twice a week. So they so graciously allow me to use their oven when I am there. So I'm just getting everything prepared. And you want to invert your sourdough onto a parchment paper, and I flour it very generously so that nothing sticks. And then I realized I can't quite invert it when I've got flour everywhere, so I end up rethinking and placed the parchment paper on top of it rather than trying to flip everything over. And I find using a plate is really helpful when I am getting the sourdough out of the basket. You do want to preheat your oven to 450 degrees. I've had so many recipes telling me don't heat the Dutch oven, and then others that do heat it. And I must have misread or maybe just forgot that this particular recipe did want me to heat my Dutch oven in the oven while the oven is coming to temperature. I didn't do that with this particular recipe this time, and that's okay. It still turned out just fine. There are some that will tell you to not have it heat in the oven and to put it in cold and vice versa. So, you know, again, things are very forgiving in my experience. And so I have my lame, and I'm just doing a very simple, very non-artistic type of design on the sourdough. That's something that I'm really going to start working on, is trying to do some really neat and fancy designs, because why not? Sourdough already feels really fancy, doesn't it? So we might as well have a really nice design on it. So I'm kind of trying to think like what I could do, and right here it doesn't look like a whole lot, but I was actually surprised on how beautiful the design comes out in the end. I was really pleased with it. Did not have any clue that it would come out so nicely. So I'm folding the four corners of my parchment paper to easily then transfer into my Dutch oven, which should have been hot, but at this current time it's not. And again, it really did not negatively affect, as far as I could see, my dough in any way. And I'm going to cook it with the lid on for 30 minutes, and then I will bake it again with the lid off for 20 minutes, and if need be, I could finish it straight on the oven rack for an additional 5 to 10. I think it turned out beautiful, and if I didn't have the TV going in the background, I probably would have did the tap test for you to hear just how beautiful that dough, that bread now sounds. It was very like a nice hearty crusty type of bread sound. It was just magnificent. Even better is it tasted wonderful as well. I am definitely going to continue to try and experiment with different recipes and different methods. When I cut into this particular sourdough, I was actually surprised that I didn't have the same type of big nooks and crannies as I did with the very first recipe that I did. But at the end of the day, as long as it tastes good and my family eats it and nothing goes to waste, it's all considered a win in my book. So that day I came home, because it is in fact the case of the traveling sourdough. So I am finally at home dishing up dinner, I had a beef and barley stew going in the crock pot, and I just knew my sourdough would go lovely, and it did. It paired wonderfully. So I thank you for watching and joining me in my journey with sourdough. Please leave your suggestions. Thank you for subscribing, and I'll see you the next time.